is we are going to look at Esther. And so that's going to be our new one. I'm excited about it. It's a good study, the book of Esther is. I don't think I've ever had a class on Esther. I've preached on Esther, talked about it, but not really had a class on it. So it'd be interesting. There's a lot of history there. You know me, I like history. And so there's a lot of history with Esther too. So it'll be a good study. But tonight we're going to be in Acts. So the next couple weeks we're going to keep continuing on in our class in Acts. We're in Acts chapter 18. And we got down to, I think, about verse 8, didn't we? We really didn't get that far on Sunday. Point 3.
Down below E, point 3.
Yeah. Yep. Okay. Yep. That's right. That's about where I thought. Verse 7 and 8. So yeah, Acts chapter 18, verse 7 and 8. I'll read that again. It says, "And he departed from there and entered the house of a certain man named Justus, who worshipped God, whose house was next door to the synagogue. Then Crispus, the ruler of the synagogue, believed on the Lord with all his household, and many of the Corinthians, hearing, believed and were baptized." And so I think the last verse that we looked at was 1 Corinthians. We were going to talk about that. Somebody go to 1 Corinthians 1. That's where we got to. 1 verse 10 through 17. 1 Corinthians chapter 1, 10 through 17. Anybody want to read? Chapter 1, verse 10 through 17.
Okay. Now I beseech you, brethren, by the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, that ye all speak the same thing, and that there be no divisions among you, but that ye be perfectly joined together in the same mind and in the same judgment. For it hath been declared unto me and you, my brethren, by them which are of the house of Chloe, that there are contentions among you. Now this I say, that every one of you say, I am of Paul, and I of Apollos, and I of Cephas, and I of Christ. Is Christ divided? Was Paul crucified for you, or were you baptized in the name of Paul? I thank God that I baptized none of you, but Crispus and Gaius.
Mm-hmm.
Lest any should say that I had baptized in mine own name. And I baptized also the household of Stephanas.
Yep.
Stephanas.
Stephanas, yeah.
Besides, I know not whether I baptized any other. For Christ sent me not to baptize, but to preach the gospel, not with wisdom of words, lest the cross of Christ should be made of none effect.
All right, so in this first part of Corinthians, we understand before in other lessons that the congregation at Corinth was very divided. They had a lot of problems with, the main thing was the division that they had with the speaking in tongues or the miraculous abilities. And so some thought that they were better than others because they were able to speak in tongues, because they thought the speaking in tongues was the greatest miracle they could do. And so those that spoke in tongues thought they were more important. And so, Paul, he's starting this chapter out in verse 10. He says, I have heard that there is division among you. And that they were divided. Well, one of the things that they were divided over was the fact of some were saying, I'm of Paul, I'm of Apollos, I'm of Cephas, I'm of Christ. What do they mean by that? Yeah. They had preacheritis. The person that baptized them, the person that taught them, was the person they followed. So what happens when that person leaves? What happens when that person does something that's not good? Yeah. Their faith is based upon Paul. Their faith is based upon Apollos. And we're going to talk about Apollos. He was a very, very big influence in the congregation in Corinth. We're going to see that later in the chapter. And so some were saying, well, Apollos is the one that taught me. And so, Paul here is saying, in verse 14, I thank God that I baptized none of you except Crispus and Gaius. And then he talks about the house of Stephanas. So we're looking at this man here in chapter 18, which was Crispus. And he was the ruler of the synagogue. Paul had baptized him. He didn't baptize very many. And his reasoning behind that, he said at the end, Christ did not send me to baptize, but to preach the gospel. I think about that passage because a lot of times when we were in school, and I'm not saying that the instructors were this way, but they would talk about, when we went through history, talking about some of the founding, the men that did a lot of preaching throughout the years, they would talk about how many they baptized. Thousands, or this many. And sometimes preachers that do a lot of mission work, they base their success upon how many baptisms they have. Paul said here, I did not go to baptize people. I went to teach them the gospel. And his purpose was just to teach them the gospel. If they were baptized, that was great. But he just let somebody else do that. And I think Apollos was one of those that did a lot of that. As we see some indications there. And so baptism is extremely important, but planting the seed is what's the most important thing. Because if you plant the seed, what's going to happen? Yeah, it grows. And that's chapter 3. Paul says, I have planted, Apollos of water, God gave the increase. And so the growth happened because of the power of the gospel. And that's what he says. If I had preached with wisdom of words, if I had preached for people to follow me because of the things that I said, he said that Christ would have made no effect. And you probably have known people this way. I've met a few people that were following a preacher. And when that preacher did something they didn't like or didn't pay attention to them anymore because they moved on to teaching someone else, they fell away. And so we got to be careful of that. Make sure that the power is in the word. And so that's what Paul, when he says here, or it's described of him just baptizing Crispus, I think that's important to note. Paul was just teaching the gospel, and Crispus was one person that was baptized. And if we go down to verse 17 of Acts chapter 18, going back there, he is replaced. So Crispus, being the person that he was, the leader of the synagogue, the ruler of the synagogue, had a lot of responsibilities. And once he became a Christian, he would have changed. He would not have had that job anymore. He's not going to be the leader of the synagogue of the Jews and teaching the old law anymore. They're going to be upset, and so they're going to replace him, and they did. And that man found that job was not what he wanted to be. And so now we're down to verse 9. And so verse 9 through 11, it says, Now the Lord spoke to Paul in the night by a vision. Do not be afraid, but speak and do not keep silent. For I am with you, and no one will attack to hurt you, for I have many people in this city. And he continued there 1 year and 6 months, teaching the word of God among them. That is a long time. Paul stayed here the second longest. He spent more time in Ephesus, but here we see that he spends a great amount of time in Corinth, and there's a reason for that, as we're going to see. But Paul, he needed some encouragement. What do you think? What was the purpose of what Christ said to him here? Yeah, so verse 9 and 10 is the words of Christ. It says the Lord spoke to Paul in a vision.
I think it definitely gave him boldness. I mean, if he knew he was going to suffer persecution, then no hold for him.
Yeah.
Didn't have to worry about it.
No, and Jesus says here, they will not hurt you here. Which, what has happened to Paul every city he's went to? Yeah, they've hurt him. They've tried, and they have succeeded several times in punishing Paul and whatever the case may be. But for some reason, here at Corinth, he was told that he would not be harmed, and he wasn't. And, of course, because Christ is in control of what happens. And so this allowed him to stay here for this long period of time. and to be able to speak boldly, also to have the encouragement to move on. You imagine going from city to city and being chased off all the time, what that would do to your morale. I mean, yeah, it'd be pretty low. And it's like, I don't want to do this anymore. And so this encouragement from Christ to not keep silent, but to preach. And really, it's amazing because I think I have this in my notes later. But you think about Corinth. Corinth had a lot of problems, didn't it? That's the whole 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, a lot of problems. Yet Paul spent a great amount of time here, and it still didn't matter. They had a lot of problems. But there was a lot of good people here, and they were still brethren. Paul loved them. Paul wrote them 2 letters because he cared about them, and they were brethren. And, I think, Corinth is an example of could be a lot of congregations today. There might be some issues, but they were still trying. And when Paul would write to them and tell them to do something, they would fix it. And so they had a good heart. So he had a lot of success here. The gospel did, really, not him, but the gospel had a lot of success in this area. And we're going to find out that once Paul left, he sends Apollos, and he spends a long time here and does a lot of good through the gospel. And so, interesting, Paul ends up staying here. He spent longer here than any congregation he had. There's a couple passages there. Acts chapter 19 verse 10 tells us he spent, I think it's 2 years in Ephesus. But it's interesting that we have Christ speaking to Paul directly. And that's happened a few times in Paul's life. Somebody read 1 Corinthians 11, verse 23.
For I received from the Lord that which I also delivered to you, that the Lord Jesus, on the same night in which he was betrayed, took bread.
Okay, so it's talking about there that the Lord had told him this. Paul was inspired, wasn't he? So not only was he inspired, which is Christ's words coming to him through the Spirit. There's more passages there. We're not going to read them all. But they say a lot of the same things. It's talking about, this is coming directly from the Lord. This is not what I'm saying. And so Jesus spoke with Paul quite a bit and encouraged him. Here it's an example of him in a vision. So while he was possibly sleeping, of course, it's at night, this came to him, and Christ speaking to him. But it's just interesting. And we're not going to read all those passages, but Acts 20, verse 35, 1 Corinthians 7, and Galatians 1 is some more examples of Paul stating that the Lord directly commanded this. And so, just interesting. We don't see that with any others that I can think of very often. All right, so then that brings us to verse 12. It says, when Gallio was proconsul of Achaia, the Jews with one accord rose up against Paul and brought him to the judgment seat, saying, this fellow persuades men to worship God contrary to us. And so Barnes has this to say: after the Romans had conquered Greece, they reduced it to 2 provinces. And so when you look at this map, you can see that. Achaia, so this is all Greece. Remember, Philippi, this area here is where Alexander the Great's from Macedonia. But they split this up into 2 parts, so Macedonia and Achaia. And this is going to be important because when we get into chapter 19 or the end of chapter 18, they're in Ephesus, and Apollos goes to Achaia. And so he is going to be working in this area, Corinth, mainly Corinth. And so it's split into 2, and that's what we're talking about here. Gallio was the brother of a celebrated philosopher, Seneca, and was made proconsul of Achaia in 53 AD. His proper name was Marcus Annaeus Novatus, whatever, but having been adopted into the family of Gallio, a rhetorician, he took his name. he is mentioned by ancient writers as having been of remarkable mind and amenable disposition. And so we're going to see he's the ruler of this area, kind of like with Christ. When the Jews had a problem with Christ, what did they try to do? Yeah, try to turn him over to the Romans, because under Roman rule, they are not allowed to deal with basically killing someone or having them punished for things because the Romans are in control. So if you wanted somebody to get punished, you had to take him before the ruler. And so that's why we see Paul several times in front of men later on when he is imprisoned by the Jews. And so here Galileo is this person. And so the Jews, are upset. Of course, where he's at. He's preaching in the synagogue. He's now converted the ruler of the synagogue. Same place, same thing. Every place that Paul went, they're upset. So they take him to Galileo. And now verse 14, or verse 13, it says, saying, this fellow persuades men to worship God contrary to the law. What law are they talking about? Yeah, law of Moses. Does that concern a Roman? You think about it, where does the old law have still some civil control at this time? Israel. There is some of that because Herod allowed that. But here they are in a Grecian nation. The old law has no effect and no matter to any of these people. It's a religious law to them, and it is for what they're following. And so that's what they're accusing Paul of. They're saying, well, he is persuading men to worship God contrary to the law. Well, also, what are Romans? They're polytheistic. They worship many gods. They allow people in their dominion to worship any god they want. What did Paul just come from? Athens, right? And it was full of gods that they worshiped. So it's really odd that they would do this because they're saying, well, he is going against the law. And I think they're trying to show it as the law for the Romans. And so verse 14, it says, when Paul was about to open his mouth, so Paul is going to defend himself, Galileo said to the Jews, if it were a matter of wrongdoing or wicked crimes, O Jews, there would be reason why I should here bear with you. But if it is a question of words and names in your own law, look to it yourselves, for I do not want to be a judge of such matters. So Galileo's smart. He's saying, this has no concern of mine. I don't care about your law. I don't care about what you believe, what you want to do. This sounds like something that's against your religion. You deal with it on your own. This is not something for me to deal with. So then verse 16 says, and he drove them from the judgment seat. And so he drives them out of there, commands them to leave. Then look at verse 17. Then all the Greeks took Sosthenes, the ruler of the synagogue, and beat him before the judgment seat. But Galileo took no notice of these things. Interesting. Every place that Paul has went, the Jews get an uprising. They go to the ruler of the city. The ruler of the city favors with them and drives Paul out, or beats him, or imprisons him, whatever the case may be. This is the first time where the leader of the city goes, he's fine. And then the people that are under Galileo, so some of the Gentiles, they take the leader of the synagogue, the leader of the Jews that is doing this, brings him before the same judgment seat they brought Paul, and beat him there. What is that going to do to the morale of the Jews?
So why would they do that, though? Because he allowed an uprising?
Because they were causing problems. Okay. That's what I see from that. Because they were causing an uprising. They were trying to get Paul banished from the city. Then really they were making false accusations because they were saying, well, it's against the law. Well, it's not.
So
But this is the Greeks, not the Jews.
Yes, this is the Greeks beating the leader of the Jews.
Okay.
So the leader of the Jews was Sosthenes, who was of the synagogue, And he more than likely was leading this charge against Paul because of what was going on. So as a display of punishment to them for what they were doing, they beat him before Gallio, and Gallio just turned his head to it.
So this was a Greek area, but under Roman
Yes.
rule, and so that could have had ramifications for him because Paul was a Roman citizen that they
Hmm.
shouldn't mess with.
Which I don't think they knew that at this time. Paul only used that a couple times.
But the Romans was pretty indifferent to religious disputes.
Yeah.
Because they allowed whatever religion you wanted.
Hmm.
And so they just didn't care unless it affected them directly.
Yeah. Exactly, and we see that in other places too, where if it affected them directly, then they would do something, and they didn't here. And so, basically, those that were the people of the city, dealt with the problem themselves, and they're saying, "Okay, Jews, you're done. You're not going to do this." And so, I believe that that's one of the reasons why Paul was able to spend so much time here, because verse 18 it starts out by saying, "So Paul still remained there a good while." He spent 18 months there. And he spent 18 months not being hurt. What did Christ say was going to happen? He said, "Be bold, don't be silent, you're not going to be harmed." Matter of fact, Sosthenes, or the Jews, were harmed because of it. So Paul was protected. He was in a city where he was allowed to freely speak and preach the gospel and stay longer than he has ever stayed somewhere, because God had a hand in it.
And I also think God knew he would be successful.
Yeah, the hearts of the people were definitely wanting the gospel here.
Do you know how long he typically stayed somewhere before he was?
Sometimes it was weeks. Yeah, it's not always stated, but usually he'll talk like he's there for 2 weeks in the synagogue teaching, and then he'll talk about the following events of what had happened, and it usually happens fairly quick. So he's not usually there for a long time.
Think about his state of mind earlier when it talks about dealing with the Jews and they were blaspheming and stuff, and he's finally like, "I've had my fill of you.
Mhm.
I'm not supposed to teach you guys. I'm going to go to the Gentiles now." So then the Lord says, "Okay, why don't you stay here and do." So think about what has happened if he converted the leader of the synagogue. That is huge as far as kind of like earthquake through the Jewish community. Their
Yeah.
leader has converted to something else, and then this person who taught him this way is also teaching Gentiles. And boy, that is, the Jews hate that.
Yeah.
So he was creating a religious group there, or teaching a religious group that was blending the Gentiles and the Jews. And so you can imagine whoever they put in charge of the synagogue after the first guy, he definitely was probably out
Yeah,
to get Paul. That was what it was all about.
for sure.
So, I mean, really, it's kind of an earthquake type situation where Paul is kind of, he's shattering the norms all the way around here. He's
Mhm.
teaching the Gentiles and the Jews together. And so in a corrupt, idolatrous city, I mean, think about it. It's probably no worse than what we would find in some of our big cities right now.
No.
You know, so, but it's kind of interesting how the ruler sounding Ptolemy with this trivial stuff. I have one more thing to do.
Yep, exactly. You know, we talked about Corinth was a Vegas of the day. There was a lot of things going on there, and this was the gospel grew greatly in this city. You know, you think about Nineveh. Nineveh was a terrible city that did terrible things, and when Jonah actually went and he started to say, "You need to repent," they did, the whole city, even the leader of the city. And so you just never know. You think, you know, this is such an ungodly place, they're not going to receive the gospel. You never know what's going to happen. That's the power of the gospel. And, you know, Paul now is able to, in a sense, take a breath. He's not being chased anymore. He can spend 18 months, not relaxing, but not looking over his shoulder, waiting for the next person to try to kill him. He can focus just on preaching. He can focus on the gospel and building the congregation there. And he does. He stays until he feels like he needs to go on. He goes to Ephesus, and he sends Apollos back, and Apollos stays there. No, he doesn't. Apollos desires to go back. We'll see that in a little bit. And so just an amazing, amazing thing that was talked about here. Now, something before we get into verse 18. So I'm going to read 1 Corinthians 1 and verse 1.
Paul called to an apostle of Jesus Christ through the will of God, and Sosthenes our brother.
Interesting. That's the same name as the man that was beaten in chapter 18 of Acts, Sosthenes. Now, we don't know if this is the same person, but he's writing the book of a letter to Corinth, and he addresses it to his brother named Sosthenes. And we read about in Acts chapter 18 of this new leader of the synagogue being beaten. Could have been that after this happened that he changed his mind and converted to Christianity and became a brother. We don't know. We're not told, but it's just interesting. We have the same name. Now, a lot of people did have the similar names, and we see that, especially with John, Peter, things like that. But it's interesting. We don't know 100%, but there's a lot of commentators that like to say, well, this is the same person. It's amazing to think, if that's the case, what came out of what happened here in chapter 18. Not only one, but two rulers of the synagogue converted to Christianity. So, but it's interesting. It's a connection. All right, so then we go to verse 18. Somebody will read verse 18 through 23, please.
And Paul, having remained many days longer, took leave of the brethren and put out to sea for Syria. And with him were Priscilla and Aquila. In Cenchrea he had his hair cut, for he was keeping a vow. And they came to Ephesus, and he left them there. Now he himself entered the synagogue and reasoned with the Jews. And when they asked him to stay for a longer time, he did not consent, but taking leave of them and saying, I will return to you again if God wills, he set sail from Ephesus. And we had landed at Caesarea, he went out and greeted the church and went down to Antioch.
Through 23, please.
And having spent some time there, he departed and passed successfully through the Galatian region and Phrygia, strengthening all the disciples.
All right, so Paul remains there a while. We just talked about that. Then he says he takes leave of the brethren and sails for Syria. So where's Syria? Well, Syria is right here. What is important about Antioch? In Syria. That's Paul's presiding or supporting congregation, the one that sent him out. So every time he starts his journeys, he always starts from Antioch, because originally, way back when he first started, he was sent to Antioch to work, and they sent Paul and Barnabas out together to start their mission work. And so at the end of every journey, Paul always goes back to Antioch. He gives a report of the things that he has done, he has been a part of, and then he is sent out again. He goes again. And so what we're seeing here is the end of Paul's journey, this journey that he has here. And so he's getting ready to start his third journey, ending his second and starting his third. And so it tells us in verse 18, I know we're about out of time. Verse 18 it says, he sailed for Syria, Aquila and Priscilla went with him, and he had his hair cut off, for he had taken a vow. So what vow this is, we don't know. But we do know that Paul had a vow. Possibly could have been a vow that he had from years before. You think about the Nazirite vow. They remember with Samson. Samson could not cut his hair. So for a period of time, under the Nazirite vow, you couldn't cut your hair. So it could have been that. Some speculate it could have been he made a vow for a period of time with God. We don't know. We just know that he did cut his hair at this point, and he was, you could pick this and say, well, what made Paul want to do this? Is this something religious? Is this something that we need to be doing? I think it's something that Paul just chose to do for himself. So I'm going to read Romans, we're going to finish here. Romans 14, verse 5 and 6.
But I think it also gains respect other people in trying to teach too.
Yeah.
Because it didn't go against anything biblical.
Mhm.
It was just a custom, basically.
Yeah, I think that's exactly what it is. It's a custom. And, he's teaching Jews. He is a Jew. He would still go back to Jerusalem for some of the feasts and things like that. And I think he deals with that. Somebody read Romans 14, 5 and 6.
One person esteems one day above another, another esteems every day alike. Let each be fully convinced in his own mind. He who observes the day observes it to the Lord, and he who does not observe the day to the Lord, he does not observe it. He who eats, eats to the Lord, for he gives God thanks, and he who does not eat, to the Lord he does not eat, and gives God thanks.
Okay, so that's just a little part of Romans 14. But Romans 14 is talking about customs, talking about opinions. And, Paul talks about days. I think that relates to specifically verse 21. It talks about how Paul was going to Jerusalem to keep the feast. Possibly could have been the day of Pentecost that he wanted to be there for. If he participated in that and he was there to teach, I don't know. We're not told. We're just told that he wanted to be there for it. But he deals with that in Romans 14 by saying that if someone wants to, they can. Now, some have tried to attribute this to holidays that we have today, as in Christmas and things like that, and saying this falls under that. That's different. I feel like it is, because these were customs that were made by God under the old law, that some still kept, customs and feasts. And the holidays we have today were pagan holidays that were started by man. So I think it's a little different. But that's a different subject to talk about. But we see Paul keeping a vow. We see him going to Jerusalem, verse 21, to keep a feast. And so, interesting to think about. Any comments or questions? All right. Thank you, guys.